Debate. The honourable member for Parkdale-HighPark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today to make it clear that the NDP objects in the strongest possible terms to Bill C-38, what we call this Trojan horse bill, because here we are, regrettably, at third reading of this massive omnibus bill. 425 pages, 753 clauses. And let's be clear what this bill does. 1/3 of this bill is dedicated to gutting environmental protection and turning back the clock on environmental protection. It makes sweeping changes to old age security and employment insurance, vital programs that Canadian families rely on. It presses a delete button on over 300,000 federal skilled worker applications for people who've been playing by the rules and waiting their turn. It opens the door to the privatization of our food safety system, and it rolls back the clock on government transparency and accountability for the future by concentrating powers in the hands of ministers and reducing oversight and reporting requirements. And these are just a few of the measures contained in this bill. Everything but the kitchen sink, Mr. Speaker, all bound up in one massive package. But there is growing national consensus that this is the wrong way to make significant changes to government policies and programs. Matthew Carroll of Lead Now confirmed that, quote, Canadians are hungry for a truly participatory democracy that works. The majority are outraged at the direction of the current government is dragging our country, end quote. And even those who agree with some of the proposed changes are decrying the lack of proper oversight and study of this bill. Conservative commentator Andrew Coyne wrote about this Trojan horse bill, and I quote, "We've no idea whether MPs supported or opposed any particular bill in the bunch, only that they voted for the legislation that contained them. There's no common thread that runs between them, no overarching principle. They represent not a single active policy, but a sort of compulsory buffet. There's something quite alarming about Parliament being obliged to rubber stamp the government's whole legislative agenda at one go." End quote. Mr. Speaker, we've tried from the outset to reach out to the government and to work with them to find an acceptable way to divide this bill into manageable parts for a more effective and more democratic study. Our attempts were thwarted. We tried to offer amendments at the Finance Committee, but not one of the 53 amendments was accepted. This even in the face of testimony that seriously cautioned the government on several of their proposed changes. Will Amos of Eco-Justice testified, quote, "There is no law that we can recall that has ever, in such a broad and structural manner, changed the federal environmental governance regime. Canadians are not ready for this. Parliament is not ready for this. There has been an adequate process to consider the transformative changes that are being proposed," end quote. Professor Marjorie Griffin-Cohen cautioned, quote, "We don't often understand or look at how various kinds of portions of the budget will interact with each other. For example, when you change the OAS and then you change employment insurance, you're going to see older people who are over 65 going to be doing part-time work and temporary work, and then they're not going to qualify for a pension, nor are they going to be able to qualify for EI if they aren't employed. So we may be pushing a lot of people in specific groups into positions of poverty," end quote. On the removal of the Inspector General's oversight from CSIS, yes, that's also in this bill, Paul Kennedy told the Commons Committee, quote, "The cost associated with the Office of the Inspector General is a small price to pay if one wants to maintain a covert intelligence agency in Canada. The elimination of the eyes and ears of the minister, if that is the course you choose to adopt, should be accompanied by a common recommendation that future missteps by the Intelligence Service will be accompanied by the resignation of the Public Safety Minister. Willful blindness as to potential problems at CSIS must carry a price. After all, responsibility ultimately rests with the minister," end quote. Mr. Kennedy is a former senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Public Safety with 20 years of experience in national security. The Conservatives dismissed his testimony as simply wrong. Finally, after time allocation in the committee, which left us with about 4 minutes of study per clause, and further time allocations in the House, we were left with attempts to delete and amend the bill at the report stage. And, Mr. Speaker, every amendment was voted down by this government. We urged the government to consult with Canadians about some of these massive changes, to hold hearings, to meet with political and community leaders. But the Atlantic premiers were not consulted about the impact of the proposed DI changes on their provinces, and key environmental organizations were not consulted about the impact of gutting environmental laws. National Chief Sean Atleo of the Assembly of First Nations testified at the subcommittee that, quote, Part 3 of C-38 needs to be withdrawn to take the time to work with First Nations to ensure their rights and interests are reflected and will not be compromised, end quote. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats did our best to open up the process by holding hearings across the country and encouraging Canadians to contact us by email, mail, and social media. Thousands did. But now, just as Canadians are realizing what is at stake, the government is determined to ram this bill through. We can only believe that their original intent was to pass this massive bill without most Canadians knowing even what was in it. Mr. Speaker, it's abundantly clear that the Conservatives are determined to shut down debate and shut Canadians out of the plans that they have for this country. We believe
that we have succeeded in democratizing the process, but it is still unacceptable that such major changes be implemented without consultation or sufficient oversight. Unfortunately, the impact of this so-called budget bill will not last only a few years. No, the consequences will be felt for decades. If the government is so confident in the measures it is putting in place, then why did it not promote them during the election campaign last year? Why is it so afraid of a public debate today? Why does it not want Canadians to know about the impact of the proposed changes on them and their families? Mr. Speaker, when did the Conservatives start fearing accountability?
That the short title of this bill, Jobs, Prosperity and Long-Term Growth, more than misses the mark. The vast majority of these 425 pages have nothing to do with the budget or economic growth. In fact, some measures will create downward pressure on the income of Canadians. The proposed DI changes will quickly move unemployed workers to lower-paying jobs or else right off EI and onto welfare. And we see other measures, such as the temporary foreign workers provisions already announced by this government, that will require an employer to only search for a Canadian to fill a job for 2 weeks before bringing in temporary foreign workers who now, for the first time, can be paid 15% less than the average wage. Economist Jim Stanford testified before the Finance Committee that, quote, it's an enormous shortage of jobs, not a lack of workers and not a lack of work ethic that explains the decline in the employment rate. Policy should be designed not to compel more labour, but rather to support Canadian families in an era where there's a chronic shortage of jobs that dominates the outlook for our labour market moving forward, end quote. Mr. Speaker, we are already living in volatile economic times. Personal debt is at an all-time high of 152% of household income, and yet there are 9 times more in cuts than in job creation measures in Budget 2012. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has cautioned that these changes will have a negative drag on our economy and overall unemployment will likely rise. Our trade deficit is high and growing. And to continue with Jim Stanford, he confirms, quote, there's a big difference between signing free trade pacts and actually doing something about trade. Canada's trade performance deteriorated badly over the last decade. The quantity of goods and services shipped abroad is 7 percentage points lower than when the Harper government took office, lower even than back in 2000. I'm sorry, than when this government took office. Our once impressive trade surplus has melted into deficit. And yet irresponsible, no-strings-attached budget cuts and tax cuts to the largest corporations have reduced the government's capacity for flexibility in these times. Mr. Speaker, this omnibus budget bill does not address these problems. Instead, it makes them worse. I look at my own community of Parkdale-HighPark. There are people who are desperate to find jobs to support themselves and their families. People work hard. sometimes at 2 or 3 jobs, yet they can't get their heads above the poverty line. I see it's a sad fact that in the city of Toronto, with all its wealth and opportunity, 1 in 3 children lives in poverty. And I see other families who are making a higher income, but who are paying exorbitant childcare fees, many thousands of dollars on top of an increasing cost of living on everything from housing to food. But their incomes are not rising accordingly. These families see nothing in the budget to provide more affordable housing, nothing in childcare, nothing to create jobs and improve their incomes in Toronto. I see young people who would love the chance to have a decent future and to be part of the economy of tomorrow, but there's almost nothing here in skills development and apprenticeship training. Young people now have twice the national unemployment rate. If they lose hope, our country will pay the price in years to come. If we invest at the front end in job skills training, in childcare, and better housing, we will all reap the benefits for years to come. Regrettably, the government's determination to grow the prison population and purchase fighter jets at the expense of these measures takes Canada in the wrong direction. It's not just morally and socially wrong, it's economically unsustainable. Monsieur le Président, nous croyons qu'il est
Mr. Speaker, we believe that it is indecent to try to introduce these measures secretly without duly informing Canadians and to force Parliament to adopt them hastily. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has many times stated that the MPs do not have the information they need to do proper oversight. And today, a legal notice took the side of the PBO in this fight concerning the proposed reductions.
Beyond our borders will likely continue to have a significant impact for some time to come. We will have a jobs crisis, likely to get worse. We have an environmental record that has plummeted among the worst under the Conservatives, and we have a government that has repeatedly misleads Canadians to serve their agenda. Mr. Speaker, Canadians need a government committed to job creation in a meaningful way, not just talking points. We need a government that understands that economic growth and environmental protection must go hand in hand. And we need a government that not only sets up a parliamentary budget office, but provides that office with the information it needs to provide real accountability for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, that's why New Democrats have been standing firmly against this undemocratic Trojan horse bill every step of the way. And that is why today I would like to introduce the following reasoned amendment. And my reasoned amendment is as follows: that the motion be amended by deleting all of the words after the word "that" and substituting the following. Quote, that this House declines to give third reading to Bill C-38, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 29th, 2012, and other measures, because this House, A, does not know the full implications of the budget cuts, given that the government has kept the details of the $5.2 billion in spending cuts from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, whose lawyer, Joseph Magnet, says the government is violating the Federal Accountability Act law and should turn the information over to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. B, is concerned with the impact of the changes in the bill on Canadian society, such as 1, making it more difficult for Canadians to access employment insurance when they need it, and forcing them to accept jobs at 70% of what they previously earned or lose their EI. 2, raising the age of eligibility for old age security and the guaranteed income supplement from 65 to 67 years, and thus driving thousands of Canadians into poverty while downloading spending to the provinces. 3, cutting back the federal health transfers to the provinces from 2017 on, which will result in a loss of $31 billion to the healthcare system. And 4, gutting the federal environmental assessment regime and weakening fish habitat protection, which will adversely affect Canada's environmental sustainability for generations to come. And C, is opposed to the removal of critical oversight powers of the Auditor General over a dozen agencies and the systematic concentration of powers in the hands of government ministers over agencies such as the National Energy Board, which weakens Canadians' confidence in the work of Parliament, decreases transparency, and erodes fundamental democratic institutions by systematically eroding institutional checks and balances to the government's ideologically driven agenda. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.